hello there, and welcome to another episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the basement every week, scaring the fuck out of you. Hey! Welcome to yet another episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the basement every week, challenging conventional thought.
So I feel like we have a confession to make at this point. We're going to have to come up with a new tagline because while our old makeshift studio did indeed begin in the basement, it has since been relocated. If you follow us on Facebook, you may have already noticed our untruth due to photos, but we are now located in the parlor. But that doesn't really sound as good, does it?
Where we sit in the parlor and talk shit.
Talk a lot of shit.
No.
We could be like, where we sit in the parlor where the colonel killed the...
Made with a candlestick?
Yeah.
Or a lead pipe?
A lead pipe.
Colonel Mustard. God damn it, Colonel
We're
Mustard.
sitting in the parlor with Colonel Mustard.
I love mustard.
Me too. Anyway. With that said, we feel guilty for living this lie and wish to remove it from our minds. Moving forward in this episode with a clear conscience. Whew. I feel downright elated. Do you feel better, Sam?
I feel like a significant burden has been lifted. A very significant burden. Moving on from that, as usual, if you haven't yet subscribed to the show, please do so via your favorite podcast listening app. Also, if you get a little time, leave us a rating and a review because it helps us gauge what you think of it, and it also helps the show by making it easier for other people to find. You can always help us out by telling a friend, or 4 friends, or all the friends. Share us on Facebook, whatever. We really like hearing from you guys, whether it be reviews, show ideas, thoughts on specific shows, how we can improve, and all of that. So it really is awesome of you to interact with us, and we really do appreciate it.
We held a listener poll on Facebook the other day, and we have so far done 2 episodes dedicated to the missing 12-year-old Iowa boy Johnny Gosch. And we've gotten a really good response from this. Many of you had already heard the story because, let's face it, it's pretty well known, especially here in the Midwest. But also, we got a lot of responses from people who hadn't. And that right there was the entire point of us dragging it back up. The majority of people are completely aware of human trafficking, but a lot of people don't know about these specific child trafficking rings here in the Midwest and the elite people who were and are still involved in them. We did the story because it's just worth bringing up. It's worth any extra awareness and light that we can shed on this issue because although most of what we have told you is kind of old news, the issue truly isn't. It's still looming over America and beyond, and the more people we have out there who are willing to look it in the face and protect the people they care about, the better.
I feel like it kind of puts a face on it, so people are less like, well, that's not something that happens around here. It's this big, giant, faceless monster that
hidden in the shadows.
You can ignore it because it doesn't relate to you at all. But I feel like, honestly, even for me, who's obsessive about these conspiracies and things, puts a face on it and made it a whole lot scarier.
That it's just a regular family in Des Moines, Iowa, and this happened, and it led to an incredible amount of other things.
Okay, so we did the Facebook poll because while we covered the story of Johnny Gosch to the best of our ability, the story does continue a bit further beyond this case. It is a very broadly believed idea that Johnny was abducted into a specific ring of child traffickers and pedophiles, while Paul Bonacci served as an unofficial witness to this abduction, also served as a witness in another case as well in a much more official capacity. Obviously, Johnny's case is incredibly tragic and heartbreaking, but unfortunately, it is so much bigger than that. For our final episode into this subject, because we simply could not bring ourselves to read about this for more than 3 straight weeks, we bring you to the blatant and appalling cover-up centered around a man named Lawrence E. King and the Franklin Credit Union of Omaha, Nebraska.
So, who is Lawrence E. King? Otherwise known as Larry King, not to be confused with the popular television personality as they are not the same person. In the late 1980s, Lawrence King was a politician for the Republican Party, who ran the Franklin Credit Union in Omaha. He officially took charge of the credit union in 1970, so it's at this point, he had been doing it for about 20 years or so. When King took over the Franklin Credit Union, it was in bad shape. He used the bootstrap philosophy to convince charities and other nonprofits along with large corporations within the area to deposit funds there as a means of supporting the city's lower class to help boost the economy in Omaha. One of his biggest supporters was the large local newspaper, the Omaha World-Herald. The paper was run by Harold W. Anderson, and he became fast friends with Lawrence King, playing a part in boosting their reputation and drawing attention to the bank, bringing in business.
King frequently called the credit union his baby.
Tiny baby.
The bank's primary objective was to assist the poor and disenfranchised population of Omaha by providing them loans and financial services. Pretty noble idea, right? Until tips started coming into the authorities that there was money missing from the credit union. Quite a lot of money. The authorities became very suspicious after the tips were determined to be credible. It was a $2 billion institution, and after an investigation was launched, $38 million were found to be unaccounted for. So at this point, the investigation moved to why the money was missing. What happened here?
It looks like around 1976, the chief accountant for the credit union, E. Thomas Harvey, discovered that a lot of funds from the bank were being used to pay some of Lawrence King's personal bills. Instead of reporting this at the time, Harvey decided that he would do the same and started paying his bills out of the fund as well. King really couldn't say much about this, or Harvey would just turn him in. So they started hanging around the credit union late at night, drafting fake ledger cards to make things look more normal to the feds. King was reported to even rub the cards on the carpet in his office so that they looked old and worn and more believable.
By the early 1980s, according to the Washington Post, King's money-making scheme got even bigger and more elaborate. The scheme he was using seems to be commonly called a boiler room. So this was difficult for me to understand, so I'm just going to quote the Washington Post directly here. He set up a boiler room at Franklin, where the salesman peddled certificates of deposit at an unusually high interest rate. As the money rolled in, more and more deposits were needed to pay interest on the deposits and underwrite King's lavish lifestyle. U.S. government insurance guaranteed Franklin's accounts, but federal scrutiny was less than rigorous. When Franklin eventually went belly up in November of 1988, the books had not been audited in 4 years. The proximate cause of the failure, according to the report submitted to a congressional subcommittee, was unbridled consumption. Even the boiler room had trouble keeping pace with King's extravagant lifestyle. The feds poured into the credit union on November 4th of 1988 and closed the whole thing down. Shut her down! End of the laneway.
So, it sounds to me like King was pretty good at coming up with schemes to siphon more money from the credit union, but could not resist the finer things in life and had some trouble not making it completely obvious that he was living well beyond his means. Several higher-ups in the Franklin Credit Union were brought up on charges of fraud and embezzlement, including manager Lawrence E. King. And this is where things start to get very interesting. About a month after the mishandling of funds was discovered, and while the accused were still being indicted, different allegations began to emerge, and these accusations came straight from the mouth of a state senator by the name of Ernie Chambers. He indicated that he felt the reports were extremely credible. I think that a state senator wouldn't be quick to accuse other members of the affluent community of Omaha of something like this if he had any doubt that it was false. However, he consistently declined to name the sources from which this information came.
Rumors began circulating and official reports started pouring in, but these people weren't talking about financial crimes. They were talking about extreme and sometimes even ritualistic cases of sexual exploitation and abuse against children, and it seemed to all be in direct association with Lawrence King and the Franklin Credit Union. The first reports had come to light earlier that year in June, well before the financial scandal. That June, a social worker at a mental health institution reported claims that they had heard about child abuse within the foster care system.
Elise Washington seems to be one of the first to have come forward, and she's kind of significant here because she was said to have been adopted by a member of Lawrence King's family. Jarrett and Barbara Webb adopted her in the 70s. By 1985, she was continuously running away from home. When questioned about this, she at first didn't want to talk about it at all. When probed further, she eventually gave in and told an elaborate story about being beaten constantly along with the other children in the home, as well as rampant sexual abuse within the home by Jarrett Webb. When it was noticed that Boys Town kept being brought up by Alecia in her stories, the investigator became alarmed. Alecia was given a polygraph test at this time prior to any of this coming to light, which she passed without question.
At this point, the rest of the Webb children were interviewed and horrifying allegations started coming to light. Jarrett Webb was the first accused, but it did not stop there. Alecia, corroborated by her sister, started talking about Lawrence King and being taken regularly to Washington, D.C. in a plane, along with other kids around her age to go to parties. She described the parties as well as various important high society people who were there. Here's part of Alicia's statement regarding the first time that she was taken to one of these little get-togethers.
The Webb said that I was going out of town for the weekend. Not going wasn't even a choice. I would have gotten beaten. We didn't have choices. We did what we were told to do. On the 2 trips that I was on, Boys Town kids were on the planes. The boys knew that they were going to be used for sex, but it didn't bother them because they were being taken care of with clothes, money, and cars. I want to say that the parties were elegant. Champagne was served and older men were wealthy and dressed very nicely. Money was exchanged and the men would leave with the boys.
The Nebraska Foster Care Review Board sent these claims straight to the police and demanded an investigation into a possible child prostitution ring and into Lawrence King specifically. Ironically, that investigation seemed to be making absolutely no progress during this time, even though it was being investigated by 3 different entities, which were the FBI, the Executive Board, and the state police. The whole time this was going on, the investigators were extremely tight-lipped about the subject, and the public was kept largely in the dark with just enough information to keep them very curious, but not enough to know what was fully going on.
There was a public session at one time in which Ernie Chambers, the senator who got the ball rolling on these inquiries, stated that Lawrence King, the credit union's manager for the past 18 years, and the central figure in its collapse were just the tip of an iceberg, and he's not in it by himself. Nothing else was added to this statement to shed further light or to answer further public questions.
One of the witnesses, Alecia Webb, actually was reported to have passed 4 polygraph tests during this time. The police state that hundreds and hundreds of hours were put into investigating this matter, but couldn't find substantial evidence to support the allegations. At this time, Robert Wadman was the police chief in Omaha and mainly in charge of leading the investigation along with the FBI. Keep Robert Wadman in mind because he will come up later on in the story.
Mr. King's lawyer went public at this time denying all of the allegations of embezzlement and stated that all of the money that King was spending so lavishly came directly from his own personal account at the credit union and was not the credit union's money. He also stated that the FBI had yet to find a credible witness as far as the allegations of sexual abuse go, and that was seemingly all he had to say on the matter.
So, when we say that Lawrence King had been spending extremely large amounts of money during his time working for the Franklin Credit Union, we mean it. Let's give you a few examples of what Lawrence King reportedly spent with his $16,200 a year income. He spent over $10,000 a month on limousines and had credit card charges in excess of $1 million.
He owned a 4-story home that sat on 26 acres overlooking the Missouri River.
In 1987, his floral bill alone topped $146,000. Man loves his flowers.
Right? He drove a $70,000 white Mercedes.
He threw a party in 1984, just before singing the Star-Spangled Banner at the Republican Convention in Texas, for which he rented South Fork Ranch, the same ranch used to film the television show Dallas, and this party cost him over $100,000.
In 1988, he threw another party for a Democrat friend who was switching to the Republican Party. He leased a warehouse in Louisiana that was regularly used to store floats for Mardi Gras. The party cost him around $100,000.
While in LA, he paid for the expensive 2-story suite at a hotel instead of a room.
While in Washington, he paid $5,000 a month for a suite on California Street that sat next to the Venezuelan embassy.
He spent $1,500 a month to have his swimming pool serviced.
He threw a party for his wife, and for this party, he flew in a band from Las Vegas, ordered an 8-tier carrot cake, and gifted her a diamond pin shaped like a cockroach. How telling.
Why a cockroach? Often shopped at Andrew Zimmerman's gourmet grocery stores with his chauffeur in tow, buying expensive champagne, steaks, and caviar.
He made large-scale donations to political parties and organizations.
He gave a $2,800 deerskin coat.
$2,800.
Yeah. I didn't say dollar, did I?
No. It sounded weird.
2,800 deers. He gave...
No. You gotta laugh.
Charlie Rogers could be a big boy.
I just imagined like the vampire on Blade that they shine the light on. That's what got me. Pearl.
Yeah, Pearl. Poor Pearl.
Pearl was an asshole.
He gave a $2,800 deerskin coat and an 18-karat gold bracelet to a young male friend of his by the name of Charlie Rogers, who was 29 years old at the time.
Another one of King's favorite young male friends told the World Herald that King wanted to own you, a sugar daddy thing. Over 2 years, he bought me $2,500 in clothes and $23,000 in furniture.
I would have reversed that. $23,000 in clothes and $2,500
right?
in furniture.
I don't need that nice of furniture.
Right? I want shoes. Yet another man flew to LA with King so that King could purchase a $23,000 chandelier for his house.
As far as the accusations made by these men, King is quoted to have called them outlandish lies uttered by scum.
So at one point, King was questioned publicly about where all of his money was coming from, if not from the credit union. He replied that his wife's family was very wealthy in Jamaica and that all of these gifts and money were coming from them. Later, when he was federally indicted, it was said by the court that no substantial gifts or inheritance from relatives ever existed. Lying son of a bitch.
You piece of shit. Dirty
You're a
piece of shit. End of the laneway. For some reason, every time someone talks about fighting.
End of the laneway. Don't come up the property.
That's the coolest laugh ever. I liked it. I actually uttered that laugh. It was real. I'm going to quote from the Washington Post as they asked some very pertinent questions. Had Nebraska law been violated as far as the age of sexual consent at 16? Had the 5-year statute of limitations for sexual assault expired for these victims? Were the airplane ticket receipts or any other documents that could corroborate the charges that minors had been transported across state lines for purposes of prostitution a federal crime? Was any of this even remotely true?
Once the door was open to this, and people started talking more and more about it, the story became a lot more clear. These people, among other members of the elite population in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., clearer to the White House itself, were being accused of involvement in an elaborate child trafficking ring in which children from specific foster homes and from the Boys Town institution were being shuttled around the country by private plane to large fancy parties for the elite at which they would provide sexual favors for high-ranking members of society all over the United States. They were often reportedly supplied drugs and alcohol and auctioned off prior to being flown to the destination of the highest bidder.
Craig Spence was another name that frequently was mentioned by these kids and another man being investigated. He was a high-profile lobbyist and power broker during the Reagan and Bush administrations who was said to have been the one,
I'll be the one,
along with Lawrence King, to get these kids into the White House for extravagant sex parties under the guise of midnight tours. He is said to have given one of the guards a very expensive watch in return for his candor and cooperation in letting them past him without mentioning this to anyone. Another time, he was said to have given the guard a piece of presidential china. Spence had bought a house in Washington, D.C., and it was reportedly bugged with audio and visual surveillance. He would allow the escorts and prominent D.C. businessmen and politicians to use his home, and then, in turn, use the audio and visual recordings of what went on there to blackmail both the boys and the affluent men who visited.
The visits to the White House do seem to be substantiated, or at least an extensive investigation was launched and found quite a bit of evidence, according to a Washington Times article. It sounds like it was definitely found to be that underage prostitutes were present around 1 a.m. on the 3rd of July, 1988 for sure. It sounds like the use of corporate credit cards was involved in paying for these escorts. It was found to be true that they were, and they were being run through a funeral home account by the funeral home director's son, without the director's knowledge. The clients' names were obtained from some of these vouchers and were found to be local military officers, businessmen, lawyers, bankers, congressional aides, and various other professionals.
The man who was spearheading this investigation was U.S. Attorney General J. Stevens, who knew several of these high-profile clients personally, as former colleagues from his time in the White House. Stevens first stated that he would be cooperative with the media, but then later withdrew this offer. Many of the clients were cooperative with the investigation, with one being listed as a highly placed Bush administration official and another being a very wealthy local businessman.
Other officials named in the article and charged with these allegations are as follows. A congressional aide to a former state representative who had previously resigned from the White House after he himself had admitted to engaging in sexual liaisons with teenage prostitutes. A former White House staffer for the Reagan administration, Craig Spence, the man who had been arranging these visits to the Reagan White House and was found to have spent over $20,000 a month on teenage prostitutes for he and his friends. Members of major news organizations, including an assistant manager of the Washington Times, who had also worked for the Office of Personnel Management in the Reagan administration.
Lieutenant General Graham, who was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time, blamed the situation on the KGB, or Soviet intelligence. He stated that because closet homosexuals in government service can be easily turned through blackmail for espionage purposes, we have always in intelligence tried very hard not to be giving classified information to known homosexuals. It is alluded that the cops were tipped to raid a house on February 28th to uncover child prostitution services and credit card fraud complaints. In the raid, authorities recovered a telephone switchboard operation that was serving around 6 different homosexual escort services. In the article, one of the chief operators of the prostitution ring stated, this investigation would be restricted because big names were involved, and he wasn't worried because a highly placed federal official would get this investigation derailed.
After all of this came to light, Spence, 49 years old, barricaded himself with a bed across the door in his hotel room at the Ritz-Carlton that he reserved using a pseudonym, Patricia Cutler. He was found dead in the hotel room under suspicious circumstances. It's difficult to say for sure if the allegations were the total cause of his alleged suicide, as he had been also diagnosed with AIDS and made the statement that he would rather kill himself than die of the disease.
So we mentioned earlier that many of these kids were associated with or were from Boys Town, Nebraska. Most know, but for those who don't, Boys Town is a village that was established in 1917, and it's been used as the headquarters for the Boys Town organization, dedicated to the care, treatment, and education of at-risk children. Their website states that at any given time, 400 boys and girls live in the village receiving care and guidance for a wide range of behavioral, emotional, and academic issues.
How did Boys Town become involved, you ask? Well, it's all very convenient. Lawrence King established himself and the Franklin Credit Union as a benefactor of sorts within the Omaha community, constantly assisting the disenfranchised. So he worked to develop a close relationship with the Boys Town organization under this guise from about 1979 forward. In an act of supposed goodwill, King invited many of the young people from Boys Town to come work at the Franklin Credit Union, gaining knowledge and life experience. They were put to work in minor roles like cleaning the bank, organizing files, and moving records around where they needed to be.
In the documentary Conspiracy of Silence, The Franklin Scandal, they report that Boys Town is the richest square mile in the world, with cash reserves over $500 million. Mostly coming from donations. The village also held several accounts within the Franklin Credit Union, which were said to have been handled only by higher-ups in the institution and no one else. So this is how he gained access to the children there. He was accused of using Boys Town as a source for young girls and boys for drug trafficking and sexual abuse.
A former Boys Town boy was interviewed and stated that it was common knowledge that Lawrence King was doing this and that Boys Town received complaints frequently about rape and molestation of these kids. I don't know how true that is. That is just the statement of another person. Previously mentioned victim Ulysses Washington stated in an interview that Lawrence King was in fact the facilitator of all of this activity, and that they went on frequent trips with him. Once, she states, he flew her to Chicago, where they went to a swanky hotel room and had her put on very little sexy clothing in front of several very prominent Chicago men, while young boys were there as well, performing sexual acts with these men.
While it was said by a few of the victims that the Boys Town administration was definitely aware of what was going on, and that the reports had been made as early as 1986, 2 years before this was made public, the administration went on to say that they did receive some reports, but when they attempted to speak with the victims about this, the allegations were denied, or the kids refused to speak. The Boys Town administration went on to say that they expressed deep regret having put these kids in this position, and that they never would have done this had they known anything like this was going on.
In 1988, the reports were brought to the Nebraska State Foster Care Review Board, who took reports by the hundreds verbally and by telephone. It was said that Larry King's name was consistently present on almost all of these reports. This review board states that they handed over a full 12-inch stack of papers that included information on these allegations and witness statements to the authorities. From here, they say that nothing was really done with this. The authorities stated that the evidence given to them was not conclusive. The review board was said to have felt that the police read the statements and determined that it wasn't conclusive immediately, instead of using the documents as leads in the beginning of an investigation. They didn't seem to think that further investigation was done at all because of the fact that the alleged perpetrators were members of the high roller elite in Nebraska and throughout America.
The Executive Board of Nebraska Legislature took the reins from here in 1988. They began their own investigation into this. Tons of statements were taken from witnesses and victims alike, and it was speculated largely that the abuse was being performed by members within the high-ranking Republican Party. At least that was the majority of the accused.
The Nebraska legislature voted to allow Senator Loren Schmidt to lead the investigation committee, but quickly rejected Schmidt's choice to involve the former CIA director William E. Colby to function as counsel. They opted instead to allow another man this position, and his name was Kirk Naylor. Naylor was quoted to have said later, "Credibility was always a big concern. It was difficult to tell whether some of these kids were playing upon the neighborhood and statewide hysteria, or were really telling the truth." The committee soon seemed to come to a rock and a hard place and found it difficult to move forward in the case. The high pressure involved in this case for them to make some sort of progress caused Naylor and 2 senators to resign from their positions.
After the Nebraska State Legislature Committee disbanded and resigned due to their lack of any progress at all, a new committee formed, with a new council, and they were a lot more progressive. In just a short period of time, they were able to produce videotape testimony of 3 new witnesses that told of extremely illegal exploitation and abuse, political sex parties, and were able to name many people involved in the exploitation or were at least present during these activities and were aware of them. The new investigator hired by this committee and the man who was making all of this great progress was a man by the name of Gary Caradori. He was hired by the committee in August of 1989. He was a former law enforcement investigator and now was an independent researcher. He was told to ignore rumor and gossip and to focus only on hard facts with solid supporting evidence. He did the legwork to interview witness after witness and immediately found even more witnesses. Many of these witnesses did give Caradori their testimony, but would later recant among reported death threats made to they and their families. 2 such witnesses that did not recant, however, and their statute of limitations would not be up, were Alecia Owen and Danny King. Their sworn testimony was recorded over 20 hours of videotape.
Senator Schmidt remained in constant contact with investigators to get to the bottom of this. Schmidt is quoted to have said that he was completely shocked by the names that were being listed, as he knew many of them personally and was disturbed that their names were being included in a list of child sexual abusers.
In December of 1989, these tapes were brought to the attention of public authorities like the FBI, the Sheriff's Office, the State Patrol, and more. John DeCamp, a former Nebraska Republican state senator, seasoned attorney, and a Vietnam veteran, was also privy to this information and to these videos, and he would later go on to write a detailed book of his involvement in the case. His book was called The Franklin Cover-Up: Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska. DeCamp's involvement was, in fact, pretty extensive, because he was the lawyer of one of the very first witnesses to come forward in the sexual abuse against children. If you remember from the past 2 episodes, a main witness in the Johnny Gosch situation, Paul Bonacci. Paul's back.
Bonacci was coming forward in this case about the same time that he was becoming embroiled in the Johnny Gosch disappearance. Bonacci claimed to be part of the sex trafficking ring in Omaha, and stated that he was initially brought in by Lawrence King, where he was used for elaborate sex parties from 1978 to 1982. He described that many of the boys were divided into groups or crews organized by Lawrence King to be ordered by the wealthy elites. Each crew had names such as Bodies by God, which was used to indicate teenage boys, and the Golden Boys, used to indicate children under the age of 10. Bonacci himself reports having been only 8 years old when his sexual abuse began, and when they weren't being flown all over America, they were frequently attending parties at a penthouse at the Twin Towers in Omaha.
Bonacci told Caradori once in an interview that he was once tied up at a party. He was molested by other boys who were instructed to do so while older men watched. He also reports being tortured and burned with cigarettes.
As Bonacci became older, he was still used as an underage prostitute within the ring, but was also instructed by Lawrence King to go out and recruit younger boys as well. Bonacci states, "We used to drive around to do a scavenger hunt to pick up younger kids. We would just win their confidence, be friends with them for a while. Start inviting them to the parties. The kids were 10 years old or older. That's how he ended up involved in the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch. He was riding with some other men, and it sounds like they just did things a little differently, and he got enmeshed in that.
In DeCamp's book, he states that the sex trafficking scandal starts at Boys Town, spiderwebs through Washington, D.C., and goes right up to the steps of the White House. He also stated that when all of this was coming to light, he became so angry at the misinformation put forth by journalists that he wrote a memorandum addressed to the Omaha World-Herald and to the public, in which he stated that the most powerful and rich public personalities of the state are central figures in the investigation. He then went on to specifically name at least 5 of them, including Lawrence King, Harold Anderson, who was a former publisher at the World-Herald, and Peter Citron, a former World-Herald columnist. He named these men the Franklin Five. He also called the major media outlets institutions of government and the heart of the cover-up. He called out specific journalists and said that they were intentionally covering up these allegations.
Another man who was running for state office got a hold of this memo and personally mailed it to over 10,000 residences in Nebraska. From there, it spread like wildfire. Obviously, this was the major release of information here because the only major media outlet at the time was the World-Herald, and I highly doubt that they were in a big hurry to release this information since 2 of the frontline accused were closely associated with the paper. John DeCamp went on to state that the press pretty much abdicated all responsibility in this matter, which seems to be the case, honestly.
The World-Herald fought back here, stating that they did cover it in 700 different stories, but they just weren't quick to make accusations in their paper or confirm what these kids were saying as the truth.
I have to go a little more in depth on one of the specific men mentioned in DeCamp's memo. Harold Anderson, former publisher of the World-Herald. I read in a few different sources that this man had been a known mentor to Lawrence King. Obviously, I feel like this is worth mentioning. Also, the fact that he constantly promoted the Franklin Credit Union and promoted very beneficial fundraising for the institution. He was chairman of the advisory committee for Franklin Credit Union as well. He denied knowing anything about these accusations of embezzlement, but a few people found this to be completely unbelievable due to his close ties with the credit union and with Lawrence King, as well as the fact as he was at one time considered to be the best investigative reporter in the history of the state. It was widely believed that he knew exactly what was going on and used his paper to help support it.
Peter Citron, another man named in the memo who was a former columnist at the World-Herald, started a lawsuit to sue John DeCamp for libel. But before he could get this done, he was brought up on unrelated charges of child sexual abuse. When the memo came out, parents were appalled because Citron had a lot of interaction with children. When the families of these children who had been in association with Citron began asking questions to their kids, the kids started telling stories. With these new testimonies against him, the police now had the right to search his home and ended up seizing thousands of documents from his house that constituted child pornography, and he went to jail. A judge was reported to have said that what he saw in these documents was frightening and shocking, and that he could not believe that it even existed. He went on to also state that it was the worst thing that he ever saw in his life.
Gary Caradori, the investigator, was said to have called Loren Schmidt on July 10th of 1990 and told him that the investigation was conclusive and they had these guys by the short hairs. The very next morning, he was on his way home from an all-star game with his son and was flying into Lincoln in a small plane that he had extensive experience in piloting. The plane crashed, and he and his 8-year-old son were killed. The strange thing about Caradori's crash is that the debris was said to have been found over 3/4 of a mile, and that a farmer reported to have seen a flash of light and heard an explosion just before the plane began to plummet to the ground.
Loren Schmidt was outraged, and it was a well-known fact by him, other investigators, and Caradori's family that he had been receiving death threats over his involvement in the Franklin case. Although Caradori would hardly speak of the case, Caradori's wife, Sandy, said that he was aware that someone important had been, at the very least, keeping an eye on him. At one point, a friend of hers from the Lincoln Telephone Company came to their house and told her that their phone was being tapped. Caradori chose to ignore this and many other things, continuing to interview witness after witness.
2 years later, the National Transportation Safety Board documented the results of a crash to have been due to the wings of the plane snapping under stress. At the time of...
I know, it's laughable, isn't it? Like think of all the evidence they've gotten so far, right?
At the time of this conclusion, Caradori's widow was allowed to pick up her husband and young son's personal belongings, but strangely, Caradori's briefcase was not returned to her. The briefcase contains several documents related to his conclusion of the child sex rank allegations and has never been found. I think it probably snapped under stress.
If I had any involvement in this case, I would snap under stress.
Right?
I'm not kidding.
Oh my God.
I think Lauren Schmidt was going to at one point.
Schmidt was reported to have said, Gary believed that something was going to come out of this investigation. He believed that the evidence was there to be developed and that things couldn't stay undercover forever.
Lauren Schmidt wrote a letter to the aviation inspector of the National Transportation Safety Board in which he strongly indicated that this was a ridiculous conclusion and that he was highly suspicious that the crash was due to an explosion, and asked that the 2 missing seats from the aircraft be further searched for and located to be sure that a bomb was not present on board that may have been overlooked by their investigation. I could not find anywhere where the aviation inspector ever responded to Senator Schmidt regarding this issue.
Caradori's plane crashed about 5 miles south of Ashton, Illinois. Remember the man that we told you to remember earlier, Robert Wadman? The police chief of Omaha at the beginning of the investigation into the Franklin scandal? Well, he was one of the authorities that were accused of blatantly not investigating the case, and he no longer worked for the Omaha Police Department. Gary Caradori's plane happened to land smack dab in the middle of his new jurisdiction that he just coincidentally happened to be the first police officer at the scene of the wreckage. That's pretty weird.
So weird.
So weird. Weird.
So how did Robert Wadman, former police chief during the Franklin scandal in Nebraska, end up in Illinois? Well, when Wadman failed to do his job investigating, he was fired by then Mayor Mike Boyle. He appealed this and he won, and remained chief until 1989. At this time, one of the major witnesses, Alecia Owen, who had been one of the witnesses who did not recant her witness testimonies among threats of death and violence, stated that she had a personal sexual relationship with Wadman and that he fathered her child.
That's when Wadman took the job in Aurora, Illinois, as their chief in 1989, for Caradori's plane to crash over a field in his jurisdiction about a year later.
After Wadman left Illinois, he took a job as a police chief in Wilmington, North Carolina. After about 3 years serving here, he was asked to resign by both the city manager and the city council. He did so on August 12, 1994. This was due to a lengthy review of morale problems in the police department.
Michael Bell of the National Weather Service office in Rockford, Illinois, reported very clear weather the night of Caradori's crash, although the National Transportation Safety Board reported, in a simple statement regarding the crash, continued his flight into thunderstorms, lost control, broke up FSS, failed to advise of pending thunderstorms. Luckily, a few of the video interviews were not with Caradori in the plane crash and were recovered by Senator Lauren Schmidt.
At this point, a grand jury has convened and is combing through the evidence and testimonies. Nebraska seems to be split here. Part of them siding with the children as there are so many like stories, detailed testimonies, naming of the same culprits, and coincidental child molestation evidence against the accused that it cannot hardly be denied. The other side is crying out that this is absolutely ridiculous and that important people's lives are being torn apart by the lies of children who are out to get attention.
Robert Wadman was also cleared later by the grand jury, who publicly announced that he was a victim in the scandal and nothing Alecia Owen said was ever found to be true. He has also launched several libel suits against various newspapers and authors, but he has not won any of them, strangely. I will say about this, though, that although I couldn't find any actual reports stating that DNA evidence was ever run on Alecia's baby, there were several statements from various people that said it was done and he was definitively found not to be the child's father. Obviously, I don't know if this is simply stated by people who are part of the cover-up and trying to discredit her, or if this is fact. But I'm sure you were wondering, like I was, about DNA testing, and that is pretty much all I found on that.
Allegations all over the U.S. began pouring in and were found to be unsubstantiated witch hunts. Reported victims were said to be suffering from something called forgotten memory syndrome, which was a new term at the time. Remember, this was a time when these ideas of pedophilia and sex trafficking were all coming to light, and there was really no set procedure on how to deal with them. There was no vetted, tried and true, evidence-based process for interviewing sexually abused witnesses or obtaining testimony at the time. On top of that, these allegations weren't just made against regular people. These accused men and women were the highest elite population in America. So, aside from a handful of brave souls, people were scared to fight against them for the most part.
The first and second grand jury both found that the allegations to be largely untrue and ruled in favor of the accused. The allegations and charges were dropped in regards to the child sex trafficking ring, despite all of the previously mentioned things. Lawrence King did go on to be tried a few months later for the fraud and embezzlement charges and received 15 years in prison for this, but that was it. Even more, remember Alecia Owen, one of the main witnesses and victims that refused to recant her testimony and who claimed to have a sexual relationship with Omaha Police Chief Robert Wadman? She was actually thrown in prison for these allegations, which the grand jury determined to be perjury. She was sentenced to 9 to 15 years on 8 counts of perjury. During the grand jury trials, there had been 4 prime witnesses. 2 of them ended up recanting their entire testimonies and then turned around and said that Alecia Owen had led them to make the video testimony and participate in the claims because she had told them that it would eventually lead to a book and a movie deal from which they would be paid. Even in the face of prison time, Bonacci and Owen never recanted. The grand jury called this a carefully crafted hoax scripted by a person or persons with considerable knowledge of the people and institutions of Omaha.
If all of this was true and all of these things did happen, it was really set up well for the perpetrators because these kids all state that they were led and forced to use drugs and drink alcohol for years while attending these traumatizing parties. So they not only grew up drug addicted, but they also carried pretty huge psychological burdens as well due to the extensive abuse that they would have suffered. All of this would have made these kids pretty easy to dismiss as credible witnesses, don't you think?
In 1993, a film crew traveled to Omaha from Yorkshire in the UK to film a television documentary about the pedophile ring. The Discovery Channel funded the project and planned to air it on their network in 1994 in both the UK and the United States. The documentary is said to have been thoroughly researched and well done, but when it was in its final stages of editing, the Discovery Channel suddenly withdrew their support for the project. They refused to air it and refused to further fund it. To this day, the film has never been aired on television, but can be found on the internet. The film is called The Conspiracy of Silence. Watch it.
It's good. This is the interesting part right here. Paul Bonacci went on later to bring a personal lawsuit against Lawrence King in 1999 for damages. In this suit, King is alleged to have conspired with public officers to deprive Bonacci of his civil rights, designed to continue to subject him to emotional abuse and to prevent him from informing authorities of criminal misconduct, with the use of battery, false imprisonment, infliction of emotional distress, organized and directed satanic rituals, forcing Bonacci to scavenge for children to be part of the defendant King's sexual abuse and pornography ring, forcing Bonacci to engage in numerous sexual contacts with the defendant King and others, as well as participate in deviant sexual games, masochistic orgies with other minor children. Damages included burns, broken fingers, beatings of the head and face, and other indignities by King. Also, for traumatizing experiences and the lingering results of these, including multiple personality disorder, the loss of a desired military career, threats on his life, sleeplessness, bad dreams, difficulty in holding a job, fear that others are following him, fear of being killed, depressing flashbacks, among other things caused by the defendant King. Despite the fact that the grand jury ruled that King was an innocent man in this matter, King would face no actual additional prison time for this. Paul Bonacci actually won this monetary lawsuit. In a memorandum of decision from the presiding judge, Warren Erbaum, the evidence is not uncontradicted, and Bonacci has suffered much. Bonacci sued for $1 million and was awarded $200,000 for this. Witnesses in this trial were Johnny Gosch, Paul Bonacci, and Paul's mother Denise Bonacci, as well as a new person by the name of Russell Nelson.
Russell Nelson was an interesting person and a name that I hadn't previously come across. I found a story in the court transcript for this monetary hearing and wanted to tell his side as well. Nelson was working as a photographer in Omaha, and one night he was taking pictures at a bar when he started talking to another guy about needing to find a steady job. The guy told Nelson that he could probably hook him up with someone who could use a good photographer. A few days later, Nelson was introduced to Lawrence King. Nelson started off photographing things like the opening of King's new restaurant, King's mansion, candid shots at King's extravagant parties, but King eventually began to outright ask him if he would be willing to shoot porn that involves kids. Nelson said that he flat out refused to do this, and King soon approached Nelson and strangely asked if he would start wearing things that King wanted him to when they went to parties. King also sent him to a hairstylist who had specific instructions on how to style Nelson's hair.
A while later, Nelson found himself at a party of King's, staring at another photographer who strangely looked identical to himself, except maybe a few inches shorter. It didn't take Nelson long to figure out that he was being set up to be a fall guy for the real child pornographer. Nelson still stuck around and did King's innocent photographic work and occupied a bedroom below the credit union. He was asked in court if he was aware of the fact that his existence before the legislative committee was effectively denied by various witnesses and an investigator for the state and by others. To this, Nelson replied that they probably said this because he had been told to disappear by FBI agents when the heat started. He was then asked why he thought that FBI agents would tell him to disappear, to which he replied, "I believe they were the ones who were involved with this. From what I understood, they were found to be a part of it."
Nelson stated that King had a lot of pull in the National Republican Convention and that one day there was a problem with a plane and Wadman didn't deal with it fast enough, so he called President Reagan. Nelson was sitting right next to him and states that he heard the voice and recognized it to, sure enough, be Reagan.
Nelson took thousands of photos at these parties. While they may not be directly pornographic, it shows a lot of the people who were there, and it shows young underage boys were present. He states that Larry King has most of the photos, but he kept at least an Apple box full. These photos were in a car with him when he was pulled over for a broken taillight, and he was arrested for a parole violation. The cops still have them, and one of the photos that may be there is one of Johnny Gosch, as Johnny was pointed out to Nelson in Portland, and Nelson quickly snapped a photo.
A couple of days after Paul Bonacci won his monetary case, Bonacci's lawyer John DeCamp wrote a letter to the Supreme Court following his ruling in the monetary case, basically stating everything that I have been thinking through reading this entire case. I'll read part of the letter now.
The trial on February 5th, 1999 resulted in a $1 million judgment. I believe that judgment completely independent from the default judgment in the case because the singular issue was damages, makes it clear that the evidence presented was credible, and Judge Erbaum acted on that basis and to send a message to a number of individuals, both clean and dirty, who were part of the Franklin saga. I believe the U.S. Attorney had no choice but to either charge the witnesses with perjury having testified under oath in a federal court on very material matters, from murder to bribery to perjury to the most vile corruption involving young people. Or the U.S. Attorney has an obligation to investigate further into the Franklin saga and reopen matters. This time, there are the pictures. This time, Rusty Nelson exists and testified completely contrary to Chief Wadman's testimony under oath to the legislature. At a minimum, some federal or state authority has an obligation to reopen, particularly the Alecia Owen case. If my witness in court February 5th, 1999 is telling the truth, then Alecia Owen is also. If Alecia Owen is lying, as a jury said, then my witnesses are lying.
This has been the final episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast regarding the Johnny Gosch and Franklin scandal issue. So we've got a bunch of new followers so far this month on Facebook, which is so awesome, but don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you can be updated when we put up a new episode, which we do every Tuesday. Also, if you get a few minutes and you feel so inclined, please rate and review the show because this helps us out tremendously and we appreciate every single one of these. So next week, we'll be right back to our cryptic and creepy stuff that we normally cover, and we have a really good topic for you guys. And we've been dying to talk about it on the show because it's pretty much the scariest, most creepy thing ever to us. So, thank you for listening this week as we told you most of the rest of the story related to Johnny Gosch and Paul Bonacci. I say most because as much information as we covered today, honestly, we didn't even scratch the surface. But we did the best we could in our short span of time for today's show. So thanks again, and see you next week.
See you next week.
See you next week.
Tuesday, not Monday.
See you next Tuesday. We'll be here with tacos. You'll be here. And tequila. Taco Tuesday.